First, you are highly praised. You act as if you are important, that you are the best, that you are worth a lot, but others don't appreciate you, so you elevate yourself step by step and put down those who are your family. All this pulls you away from your beloved friends and, of course, from your family. They should think and speak carefully. These words come from Patricia Aguilar, a young Spaniard who has experienced what it's like to be trapped in a cult that forced her to leave her homeland. With this appeal, she wanted to protect others who, like her, may have fallen under the influence of the cult. Patricia Aguilar was born in December 1999 in the Spanish city of Elche, which is located in the province of Alicante. She was the first child of Alberto Aguilar and Ana Rosa Poveda. Patricia's father worked as a haulage contractor and had to get up almost every day at 4 in the morning to drive to bakeries in an area called Gura. While Alberto worked, his wife Ana Rosa stayed at home and took care of the children, paying special attention to Patricia as she had inherited her father's heart defect. For this reason, the girl could practically not do any active sports, and even the slightest physical effort was difficult for her. Nevertheless, Patricia had a normal and happy childhood but had to experience a series of tragic events that awakened her interest in esotericism and alternative beliefs. The first serious loss for her and her family was the death of her grandfather. And only a few years later, one of Patricia's grandmothers died of cancer. After these tragic events, she thought for the first time about the existence of a life after death. Although her parents explained to her again and again how things really work, she simply couldn't believe that everything ends. These thoughts haunted her for many years. When Patricia was 16 years old, she was hit hard again when her favorite uncle Jose, who was like a second father to her, died of hepatitis. And while Patricia herself suffered from the loss of her uncle, her grandmother Carmen was devastated by the loss of her son. Perhaps it was the search for support and comfort that led the young girl and her grandmother to spend much more time together. Patricia hesitated to stay at home, as she felt that the atmosphere in the family was very tense. Furthermore, her mother was severely depressed after the death of her brother, and her father, like other men in similar situations, focused on the role of the provider and entirely on work. This was a devastating environment for the young girl. She felt lonely and vulnerable and finally fell into the clutches of a predator who suppressed her step by step. More and more often, Patricia was alone at home and was only searching the internet for information about esotericism. Within a few days, she became a member of social networks where topics that interested her were discussed. There she met a 35-year-old man from Peru named Felix Stephen Marie Gomez, who immediately offered to be her spiritual advisor. Although Stephen had only completed a degree in electrical engineering in the past, this was not the profession by which he earned his living. According to some reports, he had also completed a psychology degree and undoubtedly knew exactly how to deal with vulnerable people. He had several social media profiles on which he regularly announced the approaching end of the world. Stephen spoke of himself as a chosen man, a savior and messenger of God in the face of the impending apocalypse. In reality, he was just an ordinary cult leader who recruited and humiliated women. He promised them a better life and told them that each of them would have their own task, and they believed him. To get back to Patricia's case, at their first meeting, Stephen seemed like a man who could listen to her. They talked for quite a while about one of the messengers, and eventually he realized that Patricia was the perfect victim. First of all, she was an insecure teenager with a whole range of problems, and all this combined with her natural shyness. Put simply, Stephen took advantage of the fact that Patricia was psychologically unstable due to the death of her uncle and used his persuasive skills to draw her into his cult. Initially, the man asked her to take on various tasks, such as reading pages in religious books or writing letters on his behalf to announce to the world as quickly as possible that he was a messenger of God. Thus, The young girl began to spend most of her time running errands for her mentor, neglecting her university studies. Patricia's parents explained her poor academic performance with a simple teenage crisis. And while her relatives knew nothing about it, Stephen successfully continued his manipulations. Nobody noticed anything until it was too late. Finally, Stephen recognized that Patricia was left without any support, as she broke off all relationships with her friends and, what was worst, no longer had any trust in her family members. At this point, when Patricia fully felt her loneliness and emptiness, the man began to tell her that our world was on the brink and that more wars awaited humanity. At the same time, he claimed that in the coming apocalypse he would be nothing more than a judge, while according to him she should be one of his queens, chosen to populate the new world with perfect people. Furthermore, Stephen insisted that she save her money. This was necessary so that they could travel to Peru after she came of age. It must be said that Patricia complied with all the man's demands because at that point she already saw him as her savior. When Patricia turned 18, Stephen said it was time for her to join them. She had planned her escape from Elche long before to live with the man who called himself the Messiah. Early in the morning of January 7, 2017, Patricia got out of bed, tidied her room, and left it with all the things she had packed. Apparently, she had not informed her parents where she was going that day, so her mother, seeing she wasn't home, immediately sent her a text message. Patricia assured her that she wanted to spend time with her friends. After leaving the house, she drove directly to Murcia, a city in southeastern Spain, to visit one of her grandmother's houses. There she packed a few more things and then drove to the airport in Alicante. After a short stopover in Madrid, she flew on to Lima. At this point, Alberto, Patricia's father, realized that 6,000 euros were missing. This was his entire savings, which he had accumulated through hard work in recent years. It's hard to say why, but he immediately contacted his daughter to ask if she knew anything about the money, and she replied that she had nothing to do with it. Then Alberto asked his daughter about the whereabouts of the money, to which Patricia replied evasively and soon after turned off her phone. Later, her parents received a text message saying that she was fine and would be home soon. After several hours, however, Patricia still hadn't appeared, whereupon her parents decided to contact her friends. It turned out, however, that none of them had been in contact with her for a long time, whereupon Rosa, Patricia's mother, linked the disappearance of the money with her daughter's absence. The woman thought that someone might have forced her to steal the money or that she had been kidnapped. From that moment on, her parents began to take all possible measures to find out her whereabouts. First, they tried to reach her by phone, but since she didn't answer, they thought of the worst development of events. Finally, the relatives turned to the authorities to report her disappearance. They were told, however, that they had to wait the necessary time of 24 hours before they could file an official report. In view of this reaction from the authorities, the parents decided to act on their own and put up posters with information about their daughter. They had no idea that Patricia was already with a man in Peru whom she considered a kind of messiah. According to reports, immediately after arriving in Lima, Patricia went to a hotel to meet Stephen. There they had their first intimacy. Then they traveled to an apartment where the man lived with two other women and children. One was 42 years old, named Paula Juana Viga Pasa, and had one child with Stephen. The other was 29 years old, named Maricelo Brijal Garcia Balberta, and had 3 children with Stephen. Initially, Patricia resisted him being with other women and children, but he managed to persuade her to stay in Spain. The inactivity of the authorities forced Patricia's parents to act quickly to get her home as soon as possible. Finally, Alberto took matters into his own hands, and he and his wife began searching their daughter's personal belongings for clues as to the reasons for her sudden disappearance. So they found all sorts of drawings, printed informational material, prayers, and psalms. This all seemed very strange to them because they had never noticed that their daughter was interested in religion. According to the information on the materials found, They were all published by an organization that called itself a religious association. Its representatives preached the idea of the coming end of the world, and its leader was a Colombian who spread this belief throughout Latin America. Patricia's parents tried to gather as much information as possible about this organization, but they were not familiar with the internet or other technologies, which prevented them from making progress. Finally, the help of Patricia's cousin, Nomi, became crucial in this phase of the search. She left her business in Benidorm without much hesitation to focus on the search for her cousin, with whom she had a relatively close relationship. Patricia's parents were also supported by a woman named Maria Teresa Roches, who worked as a lawyer for an organization called SOS Desaparecidos. As they continued their search, Nomi discovered Patricia's hidden Facebook profile. It turned out that the missing person was interested in esotericism and was most frequently in contact with a man nicknamed Prince Gur. In his followers were at least 3,000 women and girls, most of whom seemed to be minors. In an effort to get to the bottom of the matter, Patricia's cousin created a fake profile on social media and added the man as a friend. However, when she tried to talk to him, he immediately blocked her, which did not prevent her from finding out that this man had been controlling Patricia for several years. In his personal correspondence with Patricia, he essentially talked about how she should behave towards the people around her. Furthermore, the alleged spiritual advisor gave her gifts and paid for cosmetic procedures in the hope that she would one day move in with him. Around the same time, while going through her daughter's personal belongings looking for more clues, Rosa discovered a sick leave certificate issued in the name of 42-year-old Paula. It contained almost all of her data, including her full name, her insurance number, and the name of the medical center she attended. It turned out that the center was not in Spain, but in Lima, the capital of Peru. Thus, Patricia's relatives learned of her possible whereabouts. With all this information, they went back to the prosecutor's office. There they added an addendum to the previously filed missing person report, which was sent to Interpol literally the same day, but that wasn't enough. Then Patricia's parents turned to the media and spread the word as best they could. The public coverage of the case had an effect, and soon Patricia contacted her parents and asked them to stop searching for her immediately. According to some reports, Patricia even sent them a photo in which she was holding a piece of paper. It had the current date and the text stating that she was with her alleged friend in Romania. This image alone aroused even more suspicion in her parents, as such behavior was absolutely not typical of Patricia. Moreover, it was quite cool in the city where she was allegedly located, and she wasn't even wearing outerwear in the photo sent. Furthermore, the sunlight hit her face. Patricia's relatives concluded that it was not her, but the person who had forced her to leave the country who had contacted them. To avoid a potential scandal, Stephen and Patricia decided to move to Mexico in March 2017. However, due to the high public profile of the case, they were denied entry into the country, whereupon they attempted to travel to Chile. It turned out, however, that some of the crew members recognized Patricia as they noticed her desolate state. They found that she looked as if she had been drugged with highly addictive illegal substances. Thereupon, the Chilean authorities also denied them entry, and they had to return to Peru. But despite the warning signs, none of them had the common sense to arrest the couple and put an end to this nightmare. Over time, the media focused more and more on the fact that clouds were gathering over his head. He took 2 more women and children with him and fled to a small town 300 km away from the place where they had previously lived. Patricia was told to go to the Spanish embassy and make a public statement to prevent possible prosecution. A few days later, Patricia actually went to the consulate and gave her full name. Since her visit fell on a holiday, she was not admitted. When evening came, she was left alone, without money and without a place to sleep. Hardly had she sat down on the sidewalk when she was approached by a woman who worked in a neighboring hotel. She handed her a piece of bread and asked her if it was okay. After a short conversation, the woman called the police. The officers came and took her to the office of a nearby radio station. It was, however, quite late and there was no one there except the security staff. Then Patricia called Stephen and pleaded with tears in her eyes to let her return to him, but the man was relentless and insisted on his own way. After that, she went to a gas station cafe and bought some cookies with the money she had left. These, however, remained untouched as she was very tired and fell asleep at the cafe table. Then she was woken up by one of the waitresses. Apparently, she realized that she had nowhere to go and finally kindly allowed her to stay for the night and gave her a hot coffee. The next day, Patricia could not go to the consulate again as she did not have an appointment. When she called Stephen, he instructed her to return to the apartment they had recently left. When she arrived there, she found only a mattress, a few clothes, and some lenses. A few days later, an event occurred that calmed everyone down a little. It turned out that Patricia had contacted the team of a famous Spanish television show called El Programa de Honor Rosa and gave them an interview via Skype. She assured them that she was in Peru of her own free will and had not been kidnapped by any cult. During the filming of the show, her father Alberto was present on the set. Patricia, however, hastened to assure everyone that she considered her deceased Uncle Jose as her father, since her own father was never at home. "Nobody has kidnapped me, neither Prince Gurdjieff nor any agnostic. My relationship with him is purely friendly and professional." After this conversation, Patricia went to the Spanish consulate, where she was finally questioned by the consul. After a short conversation, they signed a document stating that she was free and of sound mind and was voluntarily staying in another country. Furthermore, Patricia contacted the Migration Service and the Peruvian police. Thereupon, the local authorities contacted their Interpol colleagues and asked them to temporarily cease all search efforts for her. A little later, Patricia published a video in which she again declared, "Nobody has kidnapped me. I demand that the Spanish judicial authorities stop profiting from my life. The defamation of my husband violates my rights. My right to privacy, intimacy, and freedom is being unlawfully violated." After reuniting with Stephen, Patricia's life became even more difficult. They had to live in the most miserable conditions, sleeping on the floor and making do with small portions of food. The house they lived in consisted of only one room. Furthermore, there was only one bed that all his wives shared. The children all slept exclusively on the floor. Although it was uncomfortable for Patricia to sleep with him under such conditions, he forced her to do so again and again. Moreover, the man insisted that his wives regularly undergo a ritual called ayahuasca, which, along with persistent hallucinations, also caused nausea and vomiting. All in all, the living conditions got worse day by day. To avoid being recognized, Patricia stayed away from home for a long time, mainly to cook and take care of the children. Occasionally, she had to transcribe books which Stephen said would go into a library at the end of the world. The other two women left the house all day to earn some money in a neighboring restaurant. Stephen himself spent most of the day just sleeping. A few more months passed, and eventually Patricia realized she was pregnant. After much persuasion, Stephen nevertheless allowed her to have an ultrasound, which showed that she would have a daughter. This result was a real shock to the man, as he himself believed that his next child would be a boy. In January 2018, when Patricia was about 4 months away from giving birth, her economic situation deteriorated drastically. Stephen and his wives were already working on a cocoa plantation, and their income was simply no longer sufficient. Therefore, Stephen decided to move Patricia and the children to a small hut in the middle of the jungle, which had neither water nor electricity. Although Patricia repeatedly asserted that she wanted nothing to do with her parents, she was still harassed by them while she was alive, with the sole aim of bringing her home. The administrative tasks of the family and the business were placed on the shoulders of Rosa, Patricia's mother. Alberto left his delivery van to one of his relatives and set out on the long journey to be close to his daughter again. First, the man traveled to Murcia, but he failed to find a trace there. Then he contacted the parents of another girl, whom Stephen is said to have also tried to recruit for his cult, but this action also remained fruitless. Then Alberto traveled to Peru to track down his missing daughter. From there, he started a campaign to sell Patricia's remembrance bracelets and was thus able to raise about €1,500. But this money was not enough for the adventures that awaited him in a foreign country. Within just 1 week, Alberto appeared on several local television shows. He also sought help from the authorities and took it upon himself to follow up on several complaints that had been received by the ANR. In all cases, it was about lewd behavior towards underage girls. He also managed to contact a woman who had a child with Stephen. Fortunately for her, she managed to escape his clutches and even sued him for child support payments. Furthermore, Alberto hired a lawyer to represent the woman, but the investigation into this case was never initiated. The result was that Patricia's father spent almost his entire savings and had to return to Spain empty-handed. While Alberto was doing everything to find his daughter, she was left in the middle of the jungle. On May 28, 2018, in this distressing situation, her daughter asked her 2 older children when labor began. Patricia thought of running away. She was, however, convinced that simply no one would help her. But this long-lasting nightmare soon came to an end. She owed this to the courage, bravery, and love of her father, who not only did not give up but also returned to Peru at the beginning of June of the same year. Before leaving Spain, Alberto told his wife that this time he would not return without his daughter, no matter what, and he kept his word. The man contacted the relatives of Paula and Maricelo, and with combined efforts, they managed to exert the necessary pressure on the local law enforcement agencies so that they finally started the investigation. Soon after, they were able to free Patricia and the 2 other women who had been under Stephen's influence for so long. It turned out that the Special Prosecutor's Office against the illegal exploitation of human beings saw Patricia's case as essentially decisive for them and prompted them to launch an operation to apprehend the man. However, if it hadn't been for Alberto, the search could have dragged on much longer. Patricia's father literally papered every major street in Lima with pictures of his daughter and the 2 other women. Some time later, during the ongoing investigation, the authorities gained access to Stephen's recorded conversations. It turned out that Patricia had been taken to a small hut in the middle of the Peruvian jungle. On the night of June 23, 2018, an operation called Operation Prince was launched. 2 agents traveled to the location where Stephen seemed to be in a small village. First, they began questioning the locals. When they were shown pictures of Paula, they recognized her immediately. According to the interviewees, the woman occasionally worked in a local restaurant. After receiving this information, the agents began searching for Paula, hoping that she could lead them to him. Since the Peruvian authorities did not have sufficient funds, Alberto had to cover a large part of the costs. However, Stephen's exact whereabouts were eventually determined. The agents continued to monitor him as they did not believe that he could have traveled to where Patricia was at any point. But since this was not the case, they decided to act differently and arrested Stephen. When they entered the house, the man was sleeping peacefully. Besides him, Maricelo and Paula, who was 8 months pregnant, were in the house. When he realized he had been caught, he immediately demanded a lawyer. On the same day, the agents headed into the jungle to fulfill the promise made to Alberto and find his daughter. Patricia was found along with 4 children and an infant named Naomi in a hut in the Junin region on the eastern slope of the Peruvian Andes, about 450 km from Lima. According to the police report, she was sleeping on the floor with her daughter and 4 other children. Apparently, they all lived under terrible conditions, had nothing to eat for a long time, and were surrounded by garbage. Therefore, they were immediately taken to a medical center. Alberto had to hold back while waiting for news. Fortunately, the long-awaited call finally came. Although he could only see his daughter for a few seconds, he was happy. The man called his wife and told her that he had found Patricia and that they had become grandparents of a beautiful girl. So, everything was leading up to Stephen appearing before a court in Lima shortly to answer for the kidnapping of 3 women for the purpose of their further exploitation. Patricia's parents were happy that their daughter had been found, but they also feared that she might speak in Stephen's defense, as he had complete control over her thoughts. The main problem was that she was already of age, which meant it was impossible to force her to undergo a special treatment to break her relationship with the man, whom she was generally considered a victim of. The lawyer from the organization SOS Desaparecidos, Maria Teresa Roches, who was present throughout the proceedings, suggested asking the court to declare Patricia legally incapacitated. This could at least be necessary to temporarily deprive Patricia of custody of her daughter. As for Stephen, when examined by experts to create his psychological profile, he stated that he had been incarcerated because he was a fool and possessed too much vanity. According to him, no one had kidnapped Patricia and she was with him of her own free will. Against this background, the judge decided on July 13 of the same year, after hearing the arguments of the prosecution, to definitively open criminal proceedings against the man and gave the parties 4 months to collect evidence and conclude the investigation. One of her family's lawyers later revealed that he made very contradictory statements during the preliminary hearing. For example, the man said that Patricia had only traveled to Peru to be with him and take care of his children. Furthermore, the human rights defender stated that the pretrial detention was ordered by the court based on the results of a forensic psychological assessment, which had also been conducted on the women who had suffered under Stephen. According to him, all 3 women were recognized as victims of psychological domination. In the following days, the female victims told the police everything they had gone through during the time they lived with him. According to their statements, the man was a kind of head of the family and therefore set the rules. Stephen not only demanded loyalty, respect, and moral order from them, but also forbade them from going out at night. In return for obedience, he promised them enlightenment, which could only be achieved through intimacy. Patricia also told that the place where she spent the last months of her life had no electricity, no water, and no sewage system. She got clean water from a stream. Stephen's older children stated in a conversation with the police that their father regularly beat them. According to them, they didn't like him because he never worked and only gave orders. The investigations also revealed that 42-year-old Paula met Stephen in the year 2000 at a Hare Krishna temple in the center of Lima. She was 24 years old at the time and he was only 16. He met her while having a relationship with her sister, a psychologist, who was also a victim of his manipulations. At the end of July of the same year, Alberto's efforts were rewarded, and he was finally reunited with his daughter. Although the health of Patricia and her child had improved, they still had to wait for all administrative procedures to be completed before they could travel back to Spain. But in August, Patricia arrived in her homeland with her father and her 2-month-old daughter and was incredibly warmly welcomed by close friends. After only a few days, she began psychological counseling to gradually get her life back under control. Almost weekly, Patricia saw a psychologist named Miguel, who was an expert in dealing with this type of addiction in the country. In a conversation with her relatives, the specialist emphasized that they had to be patient, as Patricia's return to a normal life could be relatively slow. However, he pointed out that the presence of her daughter in her life would definitely have a positive influence on her, as she had found a new meaning in life. According to reports, Patricia truly realized the web Stephen had woven to take over her mind during the therapy process. Even during the first sessions, she herself noticed that the supposed love story eventually turned into a relationship in which her life was completely dependent on the man. After about a month of treatment, Patricia published a video in which she thanked all the people who cared for her, especially her family members. In this recording, the positive changes that had recently occurred in her were clearly visible. Many people noted that Patricia had nothing more in common with the kidnapped and disappeared woman who not too long ago said that she had left her home voluntarily. Patricia assured, among other things, that her eyes had been open to many things, and she would try to put everything that had happened to her behind her. According to her, Stephen had taken advantage of her young age and vulnerability to take control of her life. Patricia explained that the videos she recorded in Peru were not true, as she said all those things under pressure from her kidnapper. She described him as an extremely dangerous man who should not have been released from prison under any circumstances. But Aaliyah, Patricia's cousin, said they would do everything to make Stephen pay for the damage he had caused with his actions. She said some time after Patricia's public statements, she was contacted by relatives of other victims who were ready to sue the man for forced intimacy. In March 2019, Aguilar's family members could perhaps breathe a sigh of relief for the first time in a long time. However, the same applies to the parents of other girls and women, because Stephen was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the criminal exploitation of 5 different women. The court also ordered him to pay civil compensation totaling 88,000 sols, or about $26,000 to all victims. After the sentencing, Patricia's relatives were happy that the man who had tried to destroy her life had been punished. Representatives of the Gnostic Church, on their part, issued a statement denying any connection to him. They claimed he had only briefly participated in their cult and had been expelled because of his alternative views. 6 months later, in September of the same year, Patricia gave a television interview. In it, she said that realizing she needed help was the first step on her path to recovery. Patricia's case was a real inspiration for several writers and film producers who wanted to spread her story. This happened with a book by the journalist Vanessa Lozano titled Agora Bonta or Thy Will Be Done, in which she chronicled the flight of a young woman to Peru. The first fragment of the book corresponded almost exactly to the letter Patricia wrote to her daughter a few months after her liberation. "Hello, my life. I have been asked many times if I could go back, would I do it again? I wish I could spare you and my whole family this pain, but that has already happened, and now I have you with me, the little human I love more than anything in the world. You are the one I live for and the one I fight for every day. That's all. You are my little girl." In June 2023, a documentary film titled 448 Days in the Cult's Captivity, directed by Olia Figueiredo and Jose Tua, was released on the Disney Plus platform. In it, Patricia, her relatives, and an employee, another victim of Stephen Marie, recount everything they had to go through during this time. I would like to mention a bizarre and astonishing fact revealed in this documentary. When Maricelo was first arrested, he was guarded for 15 minutes by an officer who had nothing to do with the case. And when the agents who had directly arrested the man returned, this officer tried to convince them to release Stephen because he truly believed that the man was none other than the Lord God. After the premiere of this film, Patricia gave another interview on the Spanish television program El Programa de Honor Rosa, which her father had so often turned to for help. There she explained that the main idea of this project is to tell what happened to her, and to help others overcome situations they were unprepared for due to various circumstances. She pointed out that puberty is the phase in which young people are most vulnerable. Furthermore, she explained that this grooming she herself was subjected to happens quite slowly. and the main strategy is persuasion and distancing from friends and family. Moreover, Patricia said that it was important for her to spend some time with Spanish nuns. In this way, she was able to return to reality. When she was back home, she felt fear, shame, and guilt in the face of what her family had gone through because of her actions. But after her return, she realized that they were the only people who truly supported her. Patricia completed her training as a social worker and began working in a foundation for people with disabilities. And together with her cousin, she also founded a project to support victims of any form of abuse. Currently, she devotes herself almost exclusively to caring for her daughter. Luckily for Patricia, her case had a happy ending thanks to the sincere love and dedication of her family, who made unimaginable efforts to bring her home. Thanks for watching and take care.